So the question is it possible to achieve very complicated procedural results with very few nodes? And it turns out that the answer is yes. This procedural result was made with as few, exactly 10 nodes, which really illustrates the point that if you know where to place your nodes and you know some of the math and the theory behind everything, you can kind of achieve arbitrarily complex procedural results with very few mathematical operations. And in fact, for this result that I'm going to be showing you how to make, and I'm going to try to explain everything, for this one, some of these nodes I wouldn't even say count. So you can see I'm making this kind of pulsing, very complicated thing. I don't know what it is. But some of these nodes are the material output node, which is something you need to have for every node network. So I wouldn't even count that. Call that 9 nodes. We're repeating this length operation a couple times. That's kind of a bit repetitious. Texture coordinates, I don't know if people count that, but point is, there's very few mathematical operations getting us from texture coordinates to here, and it's not even something that we don't have control over. When I say procedural, I mean procedural. So for example, some stuff that we can control is this number, which I'm going to explain what all this does, but I can make this bigger, and this gives us like, a denser grid of circles pulsing, or we can make that lower. So that's one thing we can control. Another thing we can control is the speed of this. So I can make it nice and slow or faster. That's up to me. That's in my power. I can do what I want. And finally, we have this slider, which is kind of like a mystery slider. We'll talk about it. But just this one slider gives us very, very different results depending on the value. It even looks like it's nice and slow, and then it speeds up. So long story short, what is this tutorial? This tutorial is me empowering you with the weapons to fight people with proceduralism. I'm arming you, but maybe don't go to war with this. I don't know what I'm talking about. Let's get started. So this is what I'm going to show you how to make, and I think it's probably best to start with a new blend file. So let's start off with a new Blender file. I'm using version 2.83. I think that's what I'm using. Point is, just use a version after 2.82 and you'll be fine, because we need to do a certain mathematical operation that has been added since 2.82. So basically, how do we make this thing? It starts off with the modeling. Let's get rid of the cube and replace it with a plane, and you're done. You've done the modeling. That's 50% done with the tutorial already. Look at you, the Blender champ. So once you have your plane, we're going to go to the shading workspace, and I'm just going to look at this from above. It's fine to use Eevee. You can use cycles. I don't really care. But as you probably expected, all this proceduralism actually comes from the material, not the modeling. So once you have the plane and we're looking at it from above, we're just going to make a nice complicated material. And by complicated, I mean simple, because that's the point of this tutorial. Okay, so let's make a material. I'm not going to have anything going to the material output, so I'm going to delete that BSDF. So right now, nothing is going to the surface, and it's black, and that makes sense. I'm going to Shift A to add some texture coordinates, and I'm going to try my best to explain what's going on, but not kind of hammer you over the head with like, oh, you don't even know how to move your mouse, you idiot. No, we're going to keep it like intermediate. Okay, so we are going to be using texture coordinates, and the name of the game is how do we go from here to here with the manipulation in between to get that nice result that you saw before. So first of all, I am using object coordinates. Why? Because basically the whole pattern that I showed you before is circles that are getting bigger and smaller. It looks like there's more going on, but that's really it. And to make circles, I like them centered at the origin, so object coordinates do that. Whereas generated coordinates, if I cannot scroll past it, the origin is in the bottom left corner, same for UV coordinates. So object coordinates have this nice. So the first question is, how do we make a circle or a torus? Because that's the thing that we're going to be doing. The fast method is you're going to be using something called vector math. So instead of doing mathematical operations on float values x, y, and z independently, we treat this as a vector, do it all at the same time. That's the idea. And if at any point you don't know what's going on, just kind of copy the nodes and play with them, and you'll get an intuitive understanding. So first of all, how do we make a circle? I'm going to set this to length, which is going to output the length of these vectors, which kind of looks like this nice radial cardinal map. It's going to be 0, black in the middle, because that's where the vectors have a length, a magnitude, a scale of 0. And as we go further out radially, and in this case we're talking about 2D because it's a plane, but this would also apply to 3D, so it's more like a spherical gradient. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger, closer to white. Cool, so we've gone from a vector to a scalar to a single number, which means we can now start using our math nodes. And specifically, you might use something like greater than or less than to control the radius of the circle. Forget that, we're going to be doing something much better, which is the compare node. The compare node has two options. The first one is going to be something like the radius, depends how you want to define it, and the second one is going to be the thickness, or maybe I have them reversed. So let's increase the epsilon, and you can see that's giving our torus a bit of thickness, and the first value really is the radius. So you can think of this as the size of the torus or the donut and the thickness of it. Long story short, the reason this works is the compare node takes this first value and compares it to the second. And we say, okay, compare these two and make it white whenever they are within a distance of, or a radius of 0.19, or whatever epsilon we pick. So if we make this epsilon bigger, more of that's going to be white, and if we change the first value, we're going to be comparing different stuff. But long story short, we made a torus. So now the question is, how do we turn this one torus into multiple tori? Well, this mathematical operation's fine, keep it intact, but how do we change these object coordinates to be a bunch of object coordinates over and over again so we get a bunch of toruses? The trick for this is another vector math node. You're going to set this one to scale. So we can scale it by any amount, which is just going to make it more and more intense. The origin's still going to be in the middle. So let's say we pick 5. Then we're going to use another vector math node, and this is a classic trick I'm about to show you. You set this one to fraction, and you can see we just got a bunch of texture coordinates. Now these kind of look like Eevee coordinates, and we'll talk about it. But what's happening here is we're taking our object coordinates, instead of going from like 0 to 1 to -1 and all that. Now we're scaling it by 5, so it goes up to 5 and -5. And if you fraction, it's basically going to round off every time it goes to the next integer. So 0 to 5 turns into 0 to 1, 0 to 1, 0 to 1 a bunch of times over and over, which gives us this nice grid. However, if you plug this into length, you're going to see that our gradient is centered at the corner instead of at the middle like object coordinates, so a tiny adjustment is needed. So just set this to add and shift this over by -0.5, I believe, on x and y, and that will center it per the tile. Okay, so we've done that, we have the length, we have the compare, and now we have, it looks like a bunch of diamonds, but really what it is a bunch of tori, which we can change the radius of so we can actually see the toruses. So now you can see we have a donut in each one, and this is already the majority of the nodes. You can see this thing was only supposed to take 10 nodes, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this one doesn't count, 7. But I'm just going to keep this viewer node. So already, you might be thinking, how do we get from the grid of tori to the procedural flashing, pulsing thing? And this is where it gets interesting. So hopefully you're following along. Hopefully you're writing notes. You're using Blender alongside. Let's continue. Don't you love it when I put the camera up there and I'm just wasting your time? I love it. Okay, so long story short, this value, or is it the epsilon? Basically, these control the properties of each torus equivalently. Like each torus is being changed by the same amount. They're all copies of each other. But if instead of putting in a single number, let's say we were to plug in a map, well then in that case each torus would have a different property, and that's exactly what I'm going to show you to do. So let's use another length node with the object coordinates. So again, we get this radial map, and what I want to do is create a pulsing effect, a pulsing map, which I'm going to plug into this compare node. Well, how do you do that? You're going to need some math nodes. The first one I'm going to do is I'm going to add, which just kind of makes it look like it's getting brighter, but you can see how it kind of looks like pulsing if you add the right amount. So that's the first thing I'm going to do, and we want to add a different amount every frame. In fact, if we open up our timeline, we want this frame number to be pretty much what we add, so you just copy. So I'm right-clicking, you copy is new driver, and then paste driver. So you can see right now it's set to 1, then 2, 3, 4, depending on what frame we're on. So that's a driver, it controls the value. Another way to do that is instead, if you clear the driver, no, not copy, you clear the driver, you can just type in #frame, and it's going to do the same thing. And you can see it's kind of getting brighter. Once you go too high, it's hard to tell because it's so white. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to divide it by 20 so it doesn't happen as quickly. And then the trick to make it this nice pulsing thing is you add in one final math node. You set this one to either fraction or modulo, whatever you want. I'm going to use modulo. And you can see this is what gives us our nice pulsing result. What's happening here is the same way a clock goes from 1 to 12 and then it resets to 1 to 12 to 1 to 12. That's what modulo does. It makes it cyclic. And since we're adding, it's effectively giving us the animation, and the modulo is what makes it cyclic. And we can make this slower by changing the number to divide by 40, so it's going twice as slow. And the nice thing about modulo, instead of using something like fraction, which is the same idea as up here, the fraction, the nice thing about modulo is you can control kind of how the modulo works. If you have it 1, it's going to be pretty much fraction, or you could have it be 0.1 and it has a lot of rings. So once we have this, once we have this, what we said we wanted to do is use our tori and just kind of use this map to control stuff. So if I plug it into epsilon, I think this is the result that I had in the original. You could also plug it into the value and get something entirely different. So in this one, the tori are changing radius, so you can kind of see they're getting bigger and smaller. And in this one, the thickness is changing. And you can see these aren't actually perfect circles. They kind of look lopsided a little, which is interesting in its own right. So you could kind of plug it into either to get interesting results, and that's the whole network. So let's talk about what we've made, and hopefully you can take something away from this. So basically, wherever you see an exposed number, this is something we can control to get a different result, since this is procedural. For example, this is the offset we did to make our grid of coordinates centered. Now, I wouldn't mess with this, but if you wanted to, you could, and it will make different looking results, and they're interesting in their own right. So that's one thing. I'm not going to touch that, but it does exist. Assuming that we have this connected up here, so everything we did connected up here, you can change the epsilon and get different kinds of stuff. Also, you could do the opposite. You could plug it into the second value and change the number we're comparing to get different results. We can also divide by a different number to control the speed of the pulsing, and the modulo number to control the density. So if we do 0.1, it's going to be the same thing, but just 10 times denser. And actually, that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be wonky. So you can get very, very different looking results. So here you can see those pulses are very clear. With 2, it's nice and gradual. And in fact, if you wanted to, I wouldn't recommend this, you can always change the coordinates to something like generated, and now you have something that looks very different because the circles are converging to the bottom left corner, even a bit further since we did that, so it looks like it's sweeping from side to side. But that's interesting in its own right. Okay, so I feel like you've kind of learned what you need to know. One kind of tip that's a little unrelated but could help. You're going to notice that when you look at it here, it's going to be very strange. And this is an Eevee artifact. If you go to cycles, it's not going to have this issue, at least not as much. But one way to fix this is you just go to edit mode, you extrude on the z-axis a tiny bit. So you just give it a tiny bit of thickness, and it will solve that issue. And in fact, this is in some sense a 3-dimensional effect. Because all these operations are vector math type of stuff, which means it's 3-dimensional. But you just give it a bit of thickness and that solves that issue. So I hope you learned something about the idea of using very few nodes to get procedural results. Hope you learned something. Here comes the cough. Didn't do too bad. I'm a bit sick, but I'm hiding it. If you enjoyed this tutorial, the best way to support this channel, and I don't want you clicking off, I want you to listen to this spiel because I got something important to say. If you like these tutorials, the best way to support is via Patreon. Why would you want to be a patron other than keeping these channels, CG Matter and Default Cube, afloat, which is a good reason? Why would you be incentivized to do that? Well, because depending on the tier, you could get exclusive tutorials, private access, Discord access, as well as bund files, project files, depending on what I make. So you get a bunch of stuff in return just as a product, but you also get to directly support these tutorials. So that is the best way to support this channel. If that is something you're interested in, I appreciate it. Thank you. And for the 400, I like to say 420, but now it's more like 430. Goodbye, 420. For the 430-ish active patrons, thank you for making these tutorials possible. And yeah, these patrons are keeping this thing afloat. Join the ship. And yeah, I keep these advertisements, which, you know, they're personal advertisements, at the end to not be distracting for the tutorial. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. That's it. That's the show.